Andrew Badger is a guest lecturer at the University of Oxford and a former case officer with the Defense Intelligence Agency. He, along with his co-author David Shedd, former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency and a former member of the clandestine service at CIA, have written a terrific book that I recommend everyone read. It's called The Great Heist, China's Epic Campaign to Steal America's Secrets. Today, I talked to Andrew about the book, particularly its findings about what has driven Beijing to pursue this strategy of technology theft, what agencies and organizations within the Chinese state are enabling it, how companies and the U.S. government can defend themselves, and the impact of the Great Heist on America's technology lead and our economic performance. As always, your feedback and comments are welcome. You can email us at inteledge@scsp.ai. Enjoy the show. Andrew Badger, welcome to Intelligence at the Edge.
Thank you, Chip. Really excited to be here.
And I'm super excited to talk about the book that you and your colleague, David Shedd, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, but he is former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency and a former senior officer with CIA. You all have written a terrific book. I'm going to hold it up for the camera just so everybody can see it, but it's called The Great Heist. Here it is. China's Epic Campaign to Steal America's Secrets, a terrific read. I want to get into the message in the book, but before we do that, Andrew, tell me a little bit about your background. You also were at the Defense Intelligence Agency. What did you do, and when did you leave service?
Yeah, so actually a great story. Well, I started out as an intern at the DIA. I was on the North Korea desk, and I was on the analysis side, and I really enjoyed that. I had a lot of experience before in Korea. And funnily enough, David Shedd came and spoke to our intern class, and he said, I have an open door policy. And I was, your naive, early 20s intern. And I took him up on it. I emailed him and followed up. He responded with about 5 minutes, and, met with me and helped kind of mentor me. And David was, obviously he was a case officer before, and he had been at CIA, and he was being detailed at DIA as a deputy director. And yeah, kind of that began the process. I was able to, join the Defense Clandestine Service, which DIA was starting up at the time, to try to, replicate the CIA's human capabilities more towards military defense targets. And eventually, became a case officer, did about 5 or 6 years, did a couple tours, including one to Afghanistan. And now I've been in the private sector, focused on the geopolitical risk management. And we went on this journey together. I reached out to David. We both synced up and thought this would be a great idea. We'd both, I think everyone's heard how China has stolen stuff. And I was kind of at that point too. I knew China was stealing, and being an intel officer, I saw it firsthand. I saw how aggressive they were. I saw how passive we were in going after them. And I didn't fully understand though the full story, and I didn't understand the full scope of it. And that's what we set out on this journey to write this book. And I think, the end product really captures everything we learned after 2 years. So
I definitely think it does. And I love books like this because it put into one place just what you're saying, like things that we have noticed as intelligence professionals or people involved in the national security arena, and it put it there in sort of a cohesive, synthetic way. And I thought you've done a terrific job. And I want to sort of walk through some of the key findings in the piece. And let's start by rewinding the clock, because in the book, you point to something that we here at SCSP have pointed to in our own work. I've had conversations with Michael Morrell and others. Now, the year 2000, when China acceded to the World Trade Organization, can you describe for our audience why that was such a pivotal moment in this story?
So there's this fundamental question, right? Is how did China become this superpower? How did it now rival America? And there's a lot of different explanations for that. And I think when we go back in the history books, we will see 2000 is when they're formally announced, and 2001 when they formally joined. China joining the World Trade Organization was this kind of pivotal turning point. And you really have to go back and remember these assumptions that we had. So I was an undergraduate at Harvard, and we had an international relations class. And it was all about, constructivism theory. And it was all about the democratic peace theory. And the idea was, which we all kind of believed as, frankly, as kind of gospel at the time, was the more countries are exposed to capitalism, and it's automatically gonna lead to democracy. They're gonna become peaceful, and there's kind of like this Adam Smith invisible hand that would just magically transform them. And to be fair, coming after the Cold War, where we saw the Soviet Union collapse, and we saw the domination of America as a sole superpower. There was, people give him obviously a hard time, but Francis Fukuyama about end of history. But his point was more that the ideology of capitalism, liberalism had won out. And that was his kind of point that people kind of, give him a hard time about. But at the time in the 90s, that seemed like, that was the answer, right? And so these fundamental assumptions, and this is actually where the academics and theory is quite important to the real world. These theories were the underlying assumptions behind, okay, China's going to join the World Trade Organization. So this is the body that governs trade for the world. If you join the WTO, you basically have the same trade terms of every other member state. It really wiped away these kind of bilateral trade deals. And, you look back at Bill Clinton, you look back at George Bush, and all these speeches are grandiose. We have them in the book there. Clinton saying China's going to democratize, Bush saying the same thing. One great line real quick was Clinton, people were saying, well, how they might censor the internet, that type of thing. And Clinton made this joke. Oh, they're going to try to censor the internet. Everyone laughed. Everyone in the room chuckled, right? Because they were completely naive about, what China's capabilities and the internet capabilities were. So this is really the launching pad. We kind of call it, when the virus entered the system, and this, they penetrated into the global economy. They did not play by the rules, whether that was state, we have our free market companies competing against their state subsidized companies. It was never fair at the get-go. And they use that entrance point to have contact with the rest of the world. And we give this the term, the Kaspersky Doctrine. So actually the Chinese kind of learned from the Russians. If you remember the Kaspersky cybersecurity software, that was kind of everyone in the world started using it. And then they realized there's this, Russian backdoor Russian government. And it was the same kind of concept with China, that every node, every finger, every touch point with the global economy became a collection apparatus. And we had never seen that. That's never been done before, where every single, connection point, academia, think tanks, companies, state-run company, everything became collection points. And 2000 was the starting point. 2025 is when you can say, hey, they are not a third world power anymore. They are a superpower. And
But back at that time, they were still technologically,
very,
much further behind the United States and the West. So it was seen as a long road for China to catch up at the time, right? But what explains sort of the Chinese strategy? I mean, what was going on in the halls of government in Beijing that sort of explains this approach? And I love this line from the book. It's probably the most important line that I read. It. You described what happened over the last 25 years as the most consequential economic heist in history, right? So what is it that it sounds like when I read the book and understand your thesis, that this was a conscious choice by Chinese leaders? Can you describe that?
So the main thesis of the book is that espionage, industrial espionage, has been the driving catalyst to explain why China has so quickly commanded the frontiers of all these emerging technologies. I mean, look, China has a number of other advantages, which are, again, variables explaining why China's assumed this place. They have a state-run economy. You can plan out 10, 15, 20 years. You have state subsidies. You have 1.3 billion people where you can pay them slave labor. But none of those explain how they're able to leapfrog the West in so many of these critical technologies. And one thing I wish probably would have gotten into the book a little bit more, but I think most people are fairly aware of it. And there's books that have done it, more comprehensively. But getting into the motivations of the psyche of the Chinese high command, Xi Jinping, it's all about national rejuvenation. It's their, I like to use the term, it's their "Make America Great Again." Xi Jinping always uses this term, great rejuvenation of the Chinese people, and that's really rooted in this, the opium wars and this century of humiliation and the colonialization. And they said, we're never going to be dependent on the West. We're never going to be humiliated again. Another key point is they studied very closely the fall of the Soviet Union. They are not the Soviet Union. They're much more sophisticated, much more advanced, and they're not so naive to follow the same traps and the same problems that led to the Soviet Union's downfall. And I think, again, going back to why we allowed China to join the WTO, we had a lot of these same assumptions that they would follow that path. But basically, yeah, China, they launched an unprecedented industrial roadmap to develop self-sufficiency. They never wanted to be dependent on the West, and espionage became a critical tool in that toolkit, and it was given a precedence and priority and level of resources that just completely swamps the West.
So I want to get into some of the mechanics now. And referring to the book and a line that I liked, Beijing didn't just build factories, it built an entire ecosystem for harvesting knowledge. Right? What a powerful line. And let's start with the organs of the state, like the Ministry of State Security, the designated espionage entities in China. But then can you explain, what this ecosystem entails? Because it sounds like it's a whole lot more than just the MSS.
So I think the starting point I like to point out is that the MSS, so this is the China's Ministry of State Security. It's basically their CIA, FBI, and NSA combined. We've spoken to experts from the FBI, et cetera. It's roughly around 300,000 people that we know. So just to put that in perspective, that's about 3 times as much as what we, publicly acknowledge for the U.S. intelligence community. But it really doesn't capture what China has done in terms of this whole of society approach. So I think that's a term that gets thrown around a lot. I don't think people fully internalize it. But every apparatus of the Chinese state, society, and population is a potential intelligence collector. And so one of the key turning points was this 2017 law, their national intelligence law, which dictated that every Chinese citizen had to work with the intelligence community. And I think people might assume that the CIA or FBI can just go into a company and say, hey, you got to work with us, or, tell us what you're doing. It doesn't work like that. I mean, companies can cooperate, with the CIA or FBI. Most of the time they don't, because they're more worried about their quarterly profits or what have you than some type of patriotism.
I mean, if anything, there's laws on the books that
protect, which there's a
categories,
which are important for civil liberties and that type. But there isn't that line between the public sector and private sector. It's a complete. Another word is used as military civil fusion. The civilian military, it's all fused together. So with this law, they had another cybersecurity law, 2016. All data stored in China, basically, free reign to the government. And if you're doing any business with China, you have to store the data there. So they've created a legal apparatus. They've created basically every citizen in the world as a potential collector. And they've created the MSS, which has gone, arguably from, they were in the 80s and 90s, they were JV, they were crass, their case officers looked like, they dressed like a military officer, they didn't speak English, they weren't suave, they didn't know how to build rapport and that type of thing. They have very effective case officers now, and they don't just recruit Chinese nationals on appeals to, ethno-nationalism, that type of thing. They recruit the full gamut of people from all around the world. They've penetrated the CIA. They recruited a former CIA case officer, Jerry Lee, and he basically gave them the entire CIA
colleague
network.
of mine.
I was an intern at the time, and they wiped out the CIA's network, and who knows how long that's taken to rebuild it. And there's reports too. It was quite graphic. I mean, they pulled out some of these CIA assets, put him in a courtyard of a government building and assassinate him in front of everyone else. So they've built this massive apparatus that has taken every aspect of the Chinese society all towards this collection effort. And one thing we get into the book real quick is on this philosophy about espionage goes all the way back to Sun Tzu. And I know it sounds a little bit cliche, but I think Sun Tzu really informs Chinese strategic thinking. I think it's like their Bible, essentially. And Sun Tzu, the great, he's a great Chinese military philosopher. He dedicated an entire chapter to espionage. And basically his whole point was, if you're a moral leader, you have a moral obligation to devote as many resources as you can to espionage, because it's the best way to prevent wars, to win wars. You have this kind of moral obligation to your people to prevent the loss of blood and treasure. So the Chinese, they view espionage more as a critical tool in their policy toolkit, whereas in the West we still kind of see it as it's kind of a necessary thing, but we don't feel that great about it. And there's no moral qualms there. It's actually the reverse morality. If you're not engaged in espionage, if you're not doing everything you can to steal from your enemy, you're immoral. Where we kind of
sits uncomfortably in a democracy, but in China, what you're saying is culturally it's accepted and expected. And I think that probably then extends to Chinese nationals who come to the United States or go to the West to study or to work, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things. One is a lot of the Chinese case officers would frame their pitches as saying, look, China's been a third world backwater. We've been kind of stepped on by these Western imperialists. Just help us get back to even with them. You're not, you're just trying to help China get back to kind of an equal fight with the West. They obviously appeal to ethno-nationalism. But another key part of it is appealing to, and then obviously they have the legal repercussions of the 2017 law, and they are not afraid to blackmail you with your family or friends back home. One quick case was when the CIA, we actually arrested an MSS officer who was trying to recruit an employee at GE. This is the first time we've ever done that. During the court case, it came out, they actually gained access to this MSS officer's iPhone. Very sloppy tradecraft. He'd use the same iCloud account as for his espionage work as his personal life. But they found pictures of this GE agent or, GE recruit's family and friends. So they are not afraid to go after that. But there's also an interesting cultural concept, which, we don't quite fully get as Westerners. It's called guangxi. I grew up I spent a lot of time in Korea, and there's a similar concept called jung, where you build, the verb is build jung, you build guangxi. And it's kind of, a simple way of saying it is you scratch my back, I scratch your back. And so this kind of form of guangxi where they have non-traditional collectors. So it's not some, diplomat going out and helping you. It's a professor. It's a startup investor. And they build that guangxi. They invite you to a conference. They help you out. They give you this, they give you that. And there's almost like this cultural obligation to then answer their requests. And that doesn't really quite make sense to us, where it's like, hey, I'm not going to betray my country because I think I owe you something. So there's some unique aspects to the Chinese apparatus, going back again to Sun Tzu, the cultural guangxi, which have really made it a uniquely effective campaign.
So now let's talk about the impact, and can we start by asking you to kind of lay the context here? What overall has been the impact on the United States, in dollar terms, R&D stolen, IP lost? Maybe there's a dollar figure that you can associate with that, and then maybe some specific examples over the last 25 years that really stand out in your mind.
So I'll take listeners back to September of this last year. It's a fall day in Beijing, and China has done the largest military parade in recent years. This was the Victory Day parade to celebrate over Japan. And they go, this huge parade down Chang'an Avenue. So it's basically, their Times Square, down the central part of Beijing. And you had the world leaders, you had Raisi, you had Putin, you had Kim Jong-un, this kind of axis of resistance. And I think when we look back, this will be a very significant turning point. This was basically China saying to the world, hey, we're a technological superpower now. You will respect us. And they rolled out the equipment and hardware that is very advanced. And it was actually more advanced than a lot of Western technology, especially in hypersonics. They developed a new hypersonic missile, which can be launched from aircraft, which can actually now hit the United States. It can be a nuclear armed hypersonic missile, which not even Russia or the United States, which we've, self-inflicted wound on hypersonics, we can even do. So I think, that parade, which was a great capstone to when China launched their this kind of industrial planning roadmap they called Made in China 2025. So they launched that as a 10-year plan in 2015, saying, hey, we're going to go out. We want to prioritize all these different technologies, aero defense, et cetera. And you go full circle, 2025, this military parade, they're showing you what they got. This is all this is the material manifestation, all of that immaterial knowledge. And I mean, look, the consequences are it's changed the balance of power. If you want to put it figures, the FBI, they'll give this number 600, 800 billion, which is about, the entire US defense budget a year. But that number is only what we know about. So it's a you'd call it a selection bias, right? You're only seeing what we've found. How many espionage cases which have used effective tradecraft, haven't been found. And it also misses a lot of the opportunity costs. These companies that will go out of business because of this Chinese theft, they steal the IP from this company and then they can produce it with state subsidies, with a cheaper population, cheaper workforce. That company goes out of business. How do you calculate that loss? How do you calculate the loss in jobs, your broken families, welfare, your loss of tax revenues? I mean, there's kind of this exponential cost to that, which can't even really be calculated. And one key point, again, going back to IR theories, is the world is zero sum, especially in espionage. There isn't kind of this symbiotic, well, they got the technology, we've got it too, we both win. No, their gain is at your loss when they dominate a certain field. And two quick case studies on this. First is Tesla. So, we go through, we give it's a perfect example of what we call the Great Heist, this China's campaign to steal the world's technology. And through an employee at Tesla, steals Tesla's autopilot source code. So they spent, $1 billion, they called it the $1 billion thumb drive because their source code for their self-driving technology was, absolutely critical to their revenue streams. It took a lot of R&D. This guy plugs in a thumb drive, takes it back to China. Once it gets into China, who knows where it ends up? Everything is shared with everything. You fast forward, look at 2017, 2018, Tesla was the big dog. They were the champion of the EV world market. No question. I mean, you go back, fast forward to today, BYD, China's EV companies, their kind of premier EV company, is now the world's #1 market share in electronic vehicles. They're, producing these things faster than they're innovating so quickly now. They're basically dumping all of it on Europe. They're producing them so cheap. They're flooding the markets in Europe and driving out other competitors. And it's just this perfect example showing how, look, yeah, obviously there's other variables. I mean, sure, China has, put electronic vehicles as their industrial roadmap. They have a cheap workforce, et cetera, et cetera. But that doesn't explain how you can just get a source code that took Tesla, 10 or 15 years, and you can plug that in. Your leapfrog, it's a supercharge, it's an adrenaline shot, which leapfrogs you against competitors. Now just going really quick into the military world, and this one really just hurts. I mean, every time I reread the book, it just it's a dagger to my heart, is they've stolen all of our hypersonic technology. So they called it in China the Los Alamos Club, because so many former employees at Los Alamos, our premier laboratory for our nation, the place where the atomic bomb was developed, which ironically was also stolen technology from, Russian scientists, Fuchs and, those type of scientists. And, one of the lead researchers for hypersonic technology at Los Alamos, I believe his name is Dr. Shen Chen-Yi. He went back to China and started a hypersonic research center. And then he started basically recruiting all of his former postdoc colleagues, some official staff, for some reason, students were studying there. He recruited all these people back to China and replicated a lot of that technology. Combine that with stealing, doing these joint, in the UK, there was a program at the University of Manchester where they were helping work with a Chinese university on basically the ceramic coating of a hypersonic missile to make it more heat resistant. Obviously they're poaching that technology go back to China. And, China, again, like I mentioned with the military parade, they dominate hypersonic weapons. And, there's this kind of infamous moment in 2001, and it was captured in this U.S. official's quote in Financial Times, when China launched the hypersonic missile that was able to maneuver in the air and also give off like counter flares. And the official said, "We have no idea how they did this." So you look at America, right? Superpower, put a man on the moon, atomic bombs. China 20, 30 years ago, we're all farmers, backwater. Now they're doing technology, which we don't even understand. And the crazy part about that is what's going to be the number one factor in an Asia Pacific war? It's not going to be drones. It's not going to be, tanks. It's going to be missiles. How many missiles can you hit their boats? How many missiles can you hit Guam? And they dominate a lot of that missile technology now, and we let them do it. And it's quite, troublesome to think about what that's going to mean in the future.
Wow. You just said something that also is part of the story. We let them do it. We let them get away with it. So there's obviously there's a strategy from Beijing. They're devoting a lot of resources to economic and tech espionage. They have agencies, espionage organizations, a network across their ecosystem to do it. It's very aggressive. But it seems to me that it's also been reliant on, in some cases, a blind eye, in some cases, tacit cooperation or acquiescence, or just, simple lack of awareness, security awareness on the part of American companies, American academic institutions, or scientific labs. What, in your book, how do you describe the importance of that lack of security awareness?
So in the book, we kind of go through this first chapter and we kind of give these vignettes just to kind of capture, this big story. And I like to say these four horsemen. So the first one is strategic distraction. We were focused on the war on terror for 25 years, fighting terrorists in Iraq, fighting terrorists in Afghanistan, which, arguably we did have to do after 9/11, but we were focused on this counterinsurgency, while China and Russia, arguably, were focused on great power competition. We're focused on all sorts of different things. And, look, China just wasn't a priority. I mean, there was this quote from Bill Evanina, who was a top FBI official. And I remember it was from, I believe, a U.S. admiral he was talking to in 2012. And he's like, "Hey, China, stole these aircraft carrier plans." And the admiral's like, "Yeah, but how are they going to build an aircraft carrier? It's China, And it's just like this distraction we didn't care about. The second horseman, I like to call it, is the hubris one. The same thing is basically, it's China, what are they going to do? There's a great movie called Spy Game with Robert Redford and Brad Pitt. And it actually captures the whole case officer dynamic really well. But one of the things is, at the end of the movie, they launch this helicopter raid and they go into the heart of China, and they get Brad Pitt in this prison. They shut off the electric grid in China and they pull him out. And, it went back. It was kind of the 90s. It was just like, yeah, we want to go into China. We'll push them around. We'll shut off their grid, get our guy out. That would just be incomprehensible today, right? But that was kind of this hubris that we had. And one quick anecdote on that as well is that a lot of these security officials, we interviewed a few for Tesla. One of the quotes that stuck out was Elon Musk, and they were kind of warning him, "Hey, if you build this gigafactory, this battery factory for EVs in China, they're going to steal, they're going to take your stuff." And he's like, "Yeah, but we'll out innovate them. We're better." And is kind of like, well, actually, that's not the case anymore. BYD is innovating at a rapid pace that Tesla can't even comprehend keeping up with. The third one is this kind of dependency. We've become so critically dependent on China. One quick anecdote on that as well is this last summer, it came out that there was this escort program for the cloud system at the Pentagon, where basically I think it was Microsoft was having remote engineers from China, work on the Pentagon cloud system. And it was under President Obama, and Pete Hegseth, had to shut it down. And it's just remarkable that in the year 2025 we're still doing things like that. A last kind of, well, two last ones. One is the public-private sector divide. It's hard to get the private sector to take this threat, and have the cybersecurity standards, that type of thing. And if you're a startup, I've been around these people a little bit. If you're a startup in Stanford or Silicon Valley, great power politics is like the furthest thing from your mind. And the last one is a little bit more tricky in terms of it's unique to America, is this kind of political correctness. We've been scared to kind of call this out because of a backlash against Asian Americans or Chinese nationals or ethnic Chinese people. And that was actually one of the reasons why. So in 2018, President Trump created what was called the China Initiative. And so this was kind of a task force. We're going to get the whole DOJ, we're going to get all the FBI guys, we're going to go after this threat. And we spoke to an attorney general at the time who was helping run it, John Demers. And you're saying, this is really important because when the DOJ flags something as a priority, it's kind of a signal for all these FBI field agent offices to really go after that. And so, this became a priority. They had a few successes. For example, they arrested a Harvard professor named Charles Lieber, who set up a nanotechnology lab in Wuhan, Wuhan of all places. And he was replicating his work at Harvard. Of course, he'd never told Harvard. He was making $50K a month from China, of course, not paying taxes on that. And that's how they were able to wrap him up for lying about those things. But anyways, fast forward 2022, Biden administration shuts down the China Initiative. And, basically it came down to, well, we feel uncomfortable because it's singling out China. And we spoke to John Demers and he said, look, we did a whole review on this. We found no evidence of, bias or racial discrimination. But, there's just kind of one other angle here where it's like, we were willing to shut down this kind of big program going after this threat because, a little politically incorrect. And so look, it's across all these different variables, from the strategic distraction on the war on terror to this hubris to this public-private sector divide. And all these things added up to a point where, look, China has gained a huge foothold on us on a lot of emerging technology that look, we lead on some of it still, but they've caught up and surpassed us in a number of places.
Yeah, and it feels like we're unilaterally disarming, or we were. Bring us into the current moment. What is it that you think or you see China is focusing on in terms of key technologies? What are they out to acquire today? And then, last, I'd just like to kind of get your thoughts about what it is that government and private industry should be doing to think about this threat afresh and protect ourselves. But what is it that China's focused on right now?
I think, all the common things you would think of in terms of AI obviously is a huge one. We name in the book, you have to really identify your national crown jewels. And we kind of name AI as one of those. And, there's a report by China called China 2027, AI 2027. And it kind of laid out how China could leapfrog America in critical, generative AI technology. And their argument was they're just going to try to steal it. And there's actually already been a number of cases where, we could go on for another hour just talking about these ones. There was a Google employee who took a thumb drive with, 7,000 files of Google's AI, their work on their next generation GPU chips. There was an employee at the Grok, or another OpenAI. And another big one, which just drives me nuts, is there was a professor at UCLA, and he had received about 17 years worth of DoD funding, etc. He was one of the top AI experts. He packs up, goes back to China, sets up an AI center in China, and starts, recruiting all the best talent. We haven't talked about the talent recruitment program. It's called the 1,000 Talents program, where they've tried to kind of poach all the best minds from the world. They've, shut it down and they just repackage and rename it. They're still doing it today. But AI, hypersonics, another big one's quantum, the quantum computing, which will have all sorts of exponential effects on all sorts of things. One I just read today actually was quite interesting, is in their next 5-year industrial plan, so to like 2030, was marine energy. So this is something I didn't know about, but this is basically you can capture, there's machinery that can capture the waves coming
Oh,
in
right.
and
Mhm.
generate
Yes.
energy. So I went back and I found a case in the UK in 2010. The Chinese premier visited this Scottish wave energy company. It was the breakthrough company. They were the first ones to do this technology in 2004. They get an email from the Chinese vice premier, and they say, hey, we want to come do a site visit. And this was the only visit the Chinese delegation was doing outside of London. 60 people. They do a factory floor visit. They, they see all the gear. Later that night, they have a big banquet at Edinburgh Castle. It was like whiskey tasting, all sorts of things. 2 weeks, 2 weeks later, 2 weeks later, this company has a break-in they've never had before. The fence is broken in, the door's broken down. The burglars, which were never caught, to be fair, go up. They pass the first floor, which was like a Siemens office. They go to the second floor. They knew exactly where they were. They took 4 or 5 laptops. Fast forward another couple years, almost an exact replica of that wave machine shows up in China. You do the interview with the engineer, said, yeah, all these, hinges and, some of the proprietary technology is obviously displayed there. The Scottish company goes out of business. And now China, interestingly enough, is leading the world in this wave energy technology. And I looked a little bit more today and I was like, well, what is this for? Obviously, China doesn't have oil, and that's huge. But the specific application is in the islands in the South China Sea, because there it's very hard to get diesel, it's very hard to get oil. There's not much energy resources.
Or
But if
the
they can
military
capture
bases that they're setting up.
exactly, but if they can capture the wave technology, then that's a self-sustaining energy source. And so, look, it's the full spectrum. It's not like the Soviet days when they're trying to steal our nuclear warheads or our cryptology keys. It's, hey, agriculture seeds. They've caught these guys trying to smuggle different types of seeds in a popcorn bag, and they catch them at the airport. It's paint formulas. It's the formulas that protect the coating of Coca-Cola cans. It's everything you can think of which can give you any type of economic advantage is fair games to them. So basically, one final key point. This one's actually quite critical, which we didn't really make it in the book. Is China did I don't know how this didn't get more attention, but China did basically a Manhattan Project like effort to develop a lithography machine and to basically copy AMSL. So AMSL is the Dutch company. They kind of have a stranglehold over these lithography machines, which make, the semiconductor chips. It's very difficult. What they did, we have a few cases in our book. And interestingly enough, in the book, we talk about the AMSL CEO. They didn't want to go after China even after there was a theft case, and the guy basically says, "Oh, look, we're going to let bygones be bygones," because look, they were afraid of being denied that market access. Anyways, fast forward to this year, Reuters does a report. China has already developed a prototype of the AMSL machine. They recruited a bunch of these former engineers at AMSL, and they're predicting. All these predictions are always underestimating, but that China will be able to produce their own semiconductor chips within a year or two. Meanwhile, fast forward to the US, we still can't get, the CHIPS Act has kind of been a dud. We can't get any of the machines. We're still completely dependent on Taiwan, which is, 90 miles off the coast of China. And so let's put 2 + 2 here. There's a war that goes on. Our access to these chips, which, fuel everything, gets cut off. China, through espionage, has been able to develop their own chip making technology, and they can make their own chips. So it's like, again, put 2 + 2 there. What does that mean? We lose, they win. So the future is very difficult. I mean, I think the key point on the takeaway is that we need to reframe national security as economic security. And economic security is national security. We've had this bifurcation, as I'm sure during your career. It was, hey, this is a national security issue. Oh, they're trying to steal. That's a private sector issue. That whole line's been blurred and destroyed. And if we don't protect the startup lab rooms, working on the next AI, code or model weight or semiconductor chip, that's going to have real national security implications. And how we do that, it's going to require a national effort. One of the suggestions we have is basically creating an economic security council, which would be at the White House, and get that elevation priority this issue deserves, and have kind of representatives from all the different agencies, FBI, DOJ, Department of Energy, but also the private sector representatives and academia, and kind of really focus on this issue. And that's kind of like we created the National Security Council after World War II. We have to really, when the security environment changes, we have to be willing to adapt and reframe our apparatus, our security apparatus. And I think one final key point is, look, I think a lot of this stuff, and I say this at the end of the book, we know what we need to do. The question is two things, whether we have the right strategy in terms of, are we prioritizing our limited resources and sustaining that focus? Because we're going to have Venezuela pop off. We're going to have Iran pop off. We're going to have some, counterterrorism mission pop off in Africa. But can we stay focused, eye on the ball? Hey, we got to keep our focus on this issue of protecting critical IP in this great power conflict. And the other one comes down to execution. Do we have the will to really do what's necessary to protect this? Because I will tell you this, China does have the will. Xi Jinping does have the will. They're going all out on all this. And, the biggest thing I say is, it's time for us to stop playing defense. We need to go on the offense. We need to have an active counteroffensive to stop this.
Absolutely. And matter of fact, it's the galvanizing idea behind our organization, the Special Competitive Studies Project.
Yeah.
You talked about an economic security council. 3 years ago, we put out a report calling for a technology competition council, very similar in mission and scope. I think you're coming to much the same place that we did, and absolutely, the United States, in fact, needs to hit the gym and attend to its innovation ecosystem and its ability to protect its economic power. But I would encourage anybody who picks up the book to go make sure you read it all the way through, because at the epilogue, you've got 7 pillars of policy and action recommendations, which I think are spot on. We won't have time today to go through all 7, but could I ask, maybe as a way to end this, is focusing on the U.S. intelligence community or Western intelligence services. What are some things that intelligence agencies need to be thinking about, need to be focused on, need to be doing, in this intense competition with China over technology?
I think, well, one thing on the private corporate sector is, lay out this book called OPSEC, right? We're all familiar with that term if you're in the government. It's having that operational security mindset. And I think the corporate sector, having the C-suite, having your CRO, your CEO adopt that OPSEC mindset is such a huge, it sets that precedent for the rest of the company. It sets the tone saying, hey, we're going to treat our company's IP like state security, national security. And, we're going to take the proper hygiene methods. You're going to have a clean laptop when you go to this country. You're going to, we need to do these trainings. We're going to do the insider threat assessments. But it all starts with that attitude, that OPSEC mindset. Look, I think the solutions in the IC are, frankly, I think we kind of all know them. It's just a matter of that execution, that prioritization of resources. And for me, the biggest thing is mindset. Are we just going to keep playing this passive defensive mindset? I mean, I'll give an example. I was, during one of my tours, there was a Chinese, university student, and it's like, hey, should we go after him? Too much hassle. Got red tape. We got to do this with the university. Whatever. That would never comprehend the Chinese collector's mindset. It's whatever target we've got, let's go after it, hit it full speed. And, we've got to get in that mindset. We've got to get into this mindset of, they kind of view it as an existential struggle. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way, but, they're playing in that kind of mindset where we're still in
you're
this,
so right.
What about this? Or it's too hard. And so, I mean, to be honest with you, I think that would be the biggest thing for me. Obviously, there's other things with the public-private partnerships and how the FBI works with companies. Some things we've heard is not overclassifying everything, be able to share to share more. The FBI, when they engage with private sector companies, kind of having a, hey, we're not going to get you in trouble for this, but just tell us what happened, that kind of rapport and trust, because a lot of companies don't want to, hey, yeah, we got hacked or this happened, because they don't want the FBI, then creating other problems for them. Looking at startups. I will tell you, the China Select Committee is doing a lot of great things. I couldn't, name them all off my top of my head. And we actually had a lot of feedback from their staffers saying they absolutely loved the book. I wasn't able to go, but David Shedd, our co-author, he went and briefed the committee and, had a great conversation with them. And, they put out some new safeguards on AI technology. Yep. From a policy level, one of the bigger ones is we've had all these, CFIUS reviews of investment into America. We haven't been, controlling the investments out of America. We need to, control those investments both ways. And they're starting to pass legislation to finally do that. We need that bipartisan support. I don't know exactly why this hasn't happened, but we need to reignite the China initiative, this kind of DOJ task force. I have seen there was legislation that was from Republicans. Some Democrats were getting onto it as well. I don't know why that's been held up. But, that task force is important because, again, it shines the spotlight and it kind of it lights the fire under those FBI field agents. They're kind of like, mosquitoes attracted to the light. And, you need to create that incentive. So I think we need to reignite the China task force. And I mean, look, in terms of that, capital is, what David and I in the book called the Soviet test. With these VC investors, with the private equity, would you be investing that in the Soviet Union? Would you be helping the Soviet Union build out their, AI or quantum or, all sorts of things? No, because that would seem crazy. We need to apply that same mindset. And I'll end on this point. When you look at, again, this case study of how BYD leapfrogged Tesla and now is dominating electric vehicle market, which has all sorts of implications for the economy, whether these robo-taxis or what have you. Espionage is one of them that we name, but the other one is investors. And who was the top investor into BYD? Warren Buffett. And what did Charlie Munger say in one of his last interviews? BYD was one of my best investments I ever made. And it's like, you know what? Sometimes there's a little bit more to life than getting the best return, and we do kind of need that patriotic capital. And the reality is, government can't, especially in our system of government, we can't shut down everything. We do kind of have to depend on these guys of having that moral compass of saying, you know what? Yeah, maybe I will make more money in China. Maybe this investment in some Chinese quantum startup would be great. But you know what? I'm not going to do that because I believe in our country, in our mission. And that's really what I hope we get to.
Okay. Andrew Badger, thank you so much for being on Intelligence at the Edge. And thank you and David Shedd for writing this terrific book, The Great Heist. I recommend that everybody read it. And we have to have you back on again sometime soon to check in to see how we're doing against Chinese efforts to steal our technology and undercut our economy. Thank you, Andrew.
Definitely. Thanks, Chip. Really enjoyed it.